Hey, in lesson 6 and 7, we talked about imperialism in Africa. We're going to continue that today with lesson number 8, and we're going to focus on the Berlin Conference and the Scramble for Africa. The Berlin Conference began in 1884. It was intended to regulate the European colonization of Africa, and many European countries had already begun to claim territory in Africa, such as Britain, Portugal, and Belgium, or I guess Leopold at this point. And all these countries wanted more colonies, especially in Africa, to give them more resources, more power, and really more prestige. So they set up this meeting in Berlin to discuss the African problem, so to speak. Uh, all the diplomats were from Europe. No diplomat or no representation from Africa was at the Berlin Conference. So diplomats from each country discussed ending slave trade, banning the sale of guns, and banning the sale of alcohol in Africa. But really, they weren't that concerned with humanitarian missions or efforts. Their main goal was to create rules for European countries to establish colonies in Africa and to avoid war amongst each other. Africa was largely easy for them to colonize, despite the fact that it was large, had all these different types of terrain and these large armies and disease and everything else, because they weren't very industrialized. So Africa was not industrialized, but it was full of valuable resources such as copper, silver, diamonds, rubber, tea, cocoa, cotton, oil, all these types of resources that were important for the Industrial Revolution and important for a global economy. They also had a large population and they had an open market, meaning you could emerge a new market there and have these people buy your products, which wasn't extremely successful. European countries wanted to colonize Africa while also avoiding war, as we said earlier, with other European countries. They weren't so concerned about avoiding war with African territories or African colonies because the superiority of the European weapons gave them a huge advantage, especially with the invention of the Maxim machine gun and steamboats. So after the Berlin Conference, powerful European countries began to claim land in Africa as colonies at even a faster rate. And by 1914, nearly all of Africa is colonized as a European territory or colony. The colonization of Africa seemed to turn into a race between powerful European countries for colonies in Africa. This is known as the Scramble for Africa, where countries are literally competing and seeing who could claim territory the quickest in Africa and try to get the most land, but also the most prestigious and land with the best resources. The three most powerful countries in Europe during the Scramble for Africa and had the best colonies in Africa were Britain, Germany, and France. Britain had close to the most land, but had most of the valuable land, including most of that along the Nile River, the areas in South Africa, and some of the key areas in between. France had probably the most land, but a lot of their land was, in fact, in desert regions and not very valuable. Germany came in late to the game, but they had some valuable territory in East Africa and Southwest Africa, also had Cameroon and the Togo. So these three countries are going to emerge as the three most powerful countries in Europe after the Scramble for Africa. They're going to be the three most powerful countries in Europe leading into World War I, and they're going to be rivals. We talked about France and Britain being rivals before. Their rivalry is actually going to diminish a little bit, and the rivalry between France and Germany is going to get more heated, starting with the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s, and it's going to get worse during this time period. And then with Britain and Germany competing for colonies and also competing for naval strength, that's going to turn into a bitter relationship, and you're going to have this tangle of alliances, which we're going to talk about later on, between these powerful European countries trying to protect each other and avoid war with each other. So of those three, we said Britain had the most success because their land, even though it might not have been the most, it was a lot of land, nearly a third of Africa, and it was some of the most valuable land, including Egypt and South Africa. And they really wanted to have a pathway from Egypt all the way to South Africa and kind of set up a railroad and telegraph line and everything connecting South Africa to North Africa, and have a canal to trade with Asia through Upper Africa. But the one country that seemed to stand in their way and turn into a rival, as we said earlier, was Germany, claiming German East Africa as part of that, and also German Southwest Africa. Well, in 1900, or by 1900, European countries had shifted from indirect control of African colonies through a secondary source, similar to what we saw in the East India Company in India and in China, to direct rule, where the government actually ruled over the colony. And by 1914, over 90% of Africa had become European colonies. Only 2 territories remained independent. That would be Ethiopia, who actually defeated Italy in a resistance movement in the Abyssinian War. And then you have Liberia, which many consider independent. However, they were largely colonized in parts, maybe not largely colonized, but colonized in parts by the United States, where the United States kind of planned to send slaves, free slaves, back to Africa and have them set up colonies themselves in Liberia. So most all of Africa was colonized. Ethiopia was the only one that really maintained 100% their independence with their successful resistance movement against Italy toward the end of the age of imperialism. Despite efforts made during the Berlin Conference to avoid war, European countries nearly went to war against each other multiple times, with the Morocco crisis, the Fashoda incident. Most of these incidents involved France, Britain, and Germany, with Germany seeming to be the one on the outside of the other two. And distrust between these powerful European countries led to alliances, led to this tangle of distrust and militarization, and all these things are going to increase this distrust, this rivalry, everything that we talked about with the global economy. And this is going to help lead to kind of the underlying causes of World War I. So we're going to continue next lesson with imperialism in Africa. We're going to learn about the rivalry between European countries, more detail on that, and we're going to learn about the resistance movements that the African natives had against the European colonial powers. All right. Thank you. Have any questions? Email me. Talk to you guys later. Bye.